Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Duran, and on behalf of the entire team of ELCO Management, I would like to welcome you to our latest webinar with our portfolio manager, Dr. Mark Charest of the ELCO Life Sciences Separately Managed Account Program. Today's call is being recorded and will be available for replay. And if any questions should arise throughout the call, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'll hand it over to Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Appreciate everybody joining us. So, what I thought I would do by way of agenda is just give a brief introduction to myself and a little bit about the investment process we employ to select stocks and manage them. I want to then transition to just talking a little bit about how stocks trade in biotech and how that's a little bit different from other sectors. And then I'm going to switch over to show some real live data and share a little bit of a macro outlook for the sector, where it's been, where it might be going. I would then go through some specific examples to give you some, more detailed context. So feel free to interrupt anytime with questions. They're more than welcome. So just by way of background, I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in chemistry and chemical biology, and actually started my career working at big pharma in drug discovery and development. I managed an oncology-focused lab, and I've been fortunate to have been part of a number of drug discovery programs that have made it into clinical trials, including one that has made it all the way over the goal line to an FDA-approved therapeutic. I'm a co-inventor on 8 biotechnology and pharmaceutical patents, and I've been a specialized healthcare investor for over 14 years at several different billion-dollar plus specialized funds. So just a little bit about the process. And I think that, any public market investor, has some screening algorithm to take the universe of companies and whittle them down to what ultimately ends up in the portfolio. And I just want to give you a little flavor for how we do it. And so, just the top of the funnel is, really the entire life sciences corporate universe, which is over 500 discrete publicly traded companies with aggregate market capitalization over $1 trillion. And with this number of companies, obviously, it's hard to follow that many. You have to narrow it down to thematic areas of focus. And so, we do that by screening for not only financial metrics, but some scientific fundamentals. There's certain areas of drug discovery and development we think are particularly interesting, such as orphan disease development, where you can typically charge a pretty big premium for a new product, and they're typically there's a lot of diseases that don't have any therapeutic options, so you could theoretically be the first and only in class. So that's really attractive from a commercial perspective. So that's one example. There's other specific mechanisms that we find are interesting and maybe have more potential. So we use those as a big filter, and then it's really rolling up the sleeves and doing specific diligence. And a lot of this involves speaking with clinical and medical experts, folks that might be running clinical trials or doing basic scientific research that feeds into clinical development work, and picking their brains and making sure we understand the underlying science and mechanisms of how these drugs are working, what the unmet needs are, what the tolerability for side effects or safety profile might be, et cetera. So that's a big part of it. And then, of course, you have to look pretty holistically at each asset. So, in addition to the scientific and medical evidence I was alluding to, understanding the competitive landscape is critical. And this is something that, is really elevated in the last 4 or 5 years with the explosion in the number of biotech companies. The competitive landscapes for interesting areas or hot areas, have become more intense. Obviously, you have to understand the regulatory landscape in terms of FDA approval and reimbursement. What's the exclusivity of the product based on patents or based on other statutory exclusivities, et cetera. So, all of these fundamentals, you kind of have to pay attention to. There's more than a dozen of these things that you really want to pay attention to. That gets you down to what makes sense for the portfolio, and managing these positions can be challenging at times because biotech has the highest standard deviation of return out of every industry segment. So, the peak to trough moves in these stocks, often not based on fundamentals, can be pretty dramatic. So you definitely need to have a watchful eye and actively manage positions again, because of the volatility. So hopefully that gives you a little flavor for what we're doing. And if I were to summarize it in a sentence or two, we're a bottoms-up fundamental thesis-driven investor looking at science-based companies. So I hope this isn't too complicated, but what I'm showing you here are two histograms showing individual company returns, over, this is over the period of about a year. And the top group of companies are development stage companies. So these are biotech companies that do not have an FDA approved product. The bottom slate of companies are do have an FDA approved product, and they're actively commercializing them. And what you see, I just want to focus on the shape of the curve. There's not a normal distribution of returns, right? So, what you see is, you kind of have this handful of outliers, and there are, a number of companies that gain well over 100% in any given calendar year period. And then, the mean and the median company actually destroy equity value, which is kind of striking when you think about it. So, the returns are really driven by the tail, and really what you're trying to do as a biotech investor is how can you enrich exposure to companies that might be on the tail, and obviously avoid, the wipeouts. And, you're not going to catch every one of these, and you're not going to avoid every one of these, but hopefully on average, you can skew your distribution and take advantage of this profile. As you would imagine, companies that already have approved drugs, there's a little bit, the curve is shifted to the right in the sense that there are many fewer complete wipeouts, for products that get over the goal line. Doesn't guarantee success. So that might surprise some folks that, even if you do get an FDA approved drug, it doesn't mean you're going to have cash on cash return potential for the ultimate pro forma company. And, that's something you got to pay attention to, but by and large, you're in more fertile ground, and, the tail isn't as extreme, but the median is shifted to the right. So again, it's not like there's a normal distribution here. And I wanted to show these curves, and I really wanted to highlight the point that the median company in the development stage space, of which there are many hundreds of these, will destroy equity value over its lifetime. So you can't just buy and hold the median company. That's not going to work. You really have to work on enriching the portfolio for the ultimate winners. So with that, let me change over to some real-time data. Just give me a moment, please, to switch the screen over. And we can talk a little bit about where biotech's been and where it might be going. So here, let me bring this up. So what I'm showing to you here is in white. This is the XBI. It's the ETF that tracks the S&P Select Biotech Index, which historically had been an equal weight biotech index of about 100 to 125 stock. They've since changed to a market-weighted algorithm in the past quarter. So the historical data, I think, is more useful. That, excuse me, the more recent data. But suffice it to say, think of this as, a rough proxy for biotech. In white, in orange here is the S&P 500 Total Return Index, and in blue is the 10-year Treasury yield. And excuse me, there's been a pretty strong inverse correlation between the 10-year Treasury yield and biotech over the last 5 years. So this is a 5-year chart I'm showing you here. And, obviously coming out of the pandemic lockdowns, when we bottomed out the 10-year, at, kind of 50 basis points, that really led to the blast off in biotech. And, during this period, there was, excuse me, an exceptional number of new companies that did offerings and became public. And so as, interest rate environment, the macro environment changed, biotech has been in the longest and deepest pullback in its history. So the peak to trough drawdown from the first quarter of 21 through the end of last year was 65%. And, we've been a few years in duration. So again, longest and deepest pullback, and also record underperformance relative to the S&P 500 in this period of time. And, what were some of the reasons for that? Well, I kind of alluded to, there's a lot of companies that were created, having zero cost of capital and having a pandemic lockdown put a lot of spotlight onto the sector. And there was perhaps some overenthusiasm in this period. So the quality of publicly traded companies went down, the number went up dramatically. And I think a lot of business models were ultimately strained by diminishing capital availability as cost of capital changed. And so, we've been in this sort of base for a while. And I think we're at the point now where a lot of the struggling companies have been washed out. And we see great potential for the survivors, the stronger companies to re-rate higher. And if there is any kind of macro rotation out of these momentum stocks that have really driven the broader market indices, we think biotech could be a beneficiary, and we could see some really nice turnaround and sort of reversion of this record relative underperformance that we've seen. So with that, I'd like to go to some specific examples, and I'm going to highlight a few companies that are in the portfolio, actually top holdings that reported today. So, kind of timely and sort of real time. So let's do this. So one company I want to highlight is Nuerocrine Biosciences, reported this morning at the end of top 5 holding for the strategy. Currently, they're a CNS-focused mid-cap company that has an approved drug for tardive dyskinesia. That's a movement disorder. And they're developing a number of pipeline programs. And so the stock was on a tear up until, a month or so ago, where they announced data from a pipeline program that wasn't completely negative, but it was mixed. And, the stock sold off hard. And, we thought it was a little overdone. And so, we like to, again, follow these companies over time. And, when you see extreme volatility, take the opportunity to add if you believe it's warranted. And, we were chipping away a little bit when it was really being hate sold recently. And let's go through the quarter today. So, our big picture thesis here is that the base business more than justifies the current valuation of the stock. And there should be some credit given for the pipeline and to be launched drugs, which are on tap, that should re-rate this a little bit higher. So let's go through the quarter. So this was the press release from this morning. Ingrezza, that's the drug for tardive dyskinesia I mentioned. They announced sales of $613 million. That's 26% year-on-year growth. They raised full year guidance for product revenue to just over $2.3 billion. And they announced a new $300 million share repurchase program. So again, pretty robust results. And let me show you the big picture here for the stock. So this is just a graphical description of the quarter. Here's the top line revenue. In aggregate, it was $622 million. So Ingrezza is the largest contributor, but they have a small revenue from a couple other things. And so it was a top and bottom line beat. But what I really want to show is the earnings, the expected earnings trajectory of this company. So here we are. This year, 2.3 street. So I'm showing you street consensus now. This is Bloomberg consensus estimates. So street consensus is 2.33, kind of close to where the guidance is now. And, as far as you can see, there's strong double-digit CAGR for this business. And, peak sales, we can debate it, but it's kind of $4 to $5 billion range. And that's being a little bit conservative on expectations for pipeline progress, as I mentioned. So, the stock is kind of a $12 billion market cap. It's profitable. It has a double-digit compound annual growth profile. And, we believe stocks like this, have the potential to re-rate in the context of a rotation, or if there is more enthusiasm for the pipeline. Again, all the enthusiasm for the pipeline was sort of washed out in the recent data update. And, we didn't think it was that bad. It's not a complete wipeout. It was, I would say, an incremental setback, but, we think the thesis is still intact. So again, this was reported literally this morning. Stock's up a bit today. We think we'll probably see sometime over the next 12 to 18 months it kind of retest the high end of the range. All right, let's do another one. Another top 5 holding that also serendipitously reported this morning was Intra-Cellular Therapeutics, another company in the CNS space. So they have a drug it's approved for schizophrenia, called Caplyta. And they reported, strong quarter this morning. And I'll go through that now. So here's the press release. Caplyta sales were $175 million in the quarter, 39% increase over the comparable quarter last year. And most importantly, they raised 2024 sales guidance. So I love the beat and raise. We love to see this when you're getting good traction here. So it's now, just under 700 million for the 24. But most importantly, they're filing to get Caplyta approved for major depressive disorder. So this is a new indication. So right now it's approved for schizophrenia and bipolar associated with schizophrenia. This would be a major expansion of the approved indications in major depressive disorder. And it could materially increase the market potential by a couple of $1 billion. So looking again at the quarter here, they're not yet profitable. It's a top line growth story, but they have over $1 billion in cash and they're well funded through cash flow break even. And if we look at, longer term consensus estimates here, folks are thinking, so the management is guiding to a $5 billion peak potential for Caplyta. Street is a little more conservative, although I think there's room for folks to inch this up. Certainly after the major depressive disorder approval comes through in the next 12 months. Again, you have strong double-digit CAGR profile here. This company, I do believe, could be an acquisition candidate. There are a lot of big pharmas and large biotech companies that need to augment loss of exclusivity for current branded drugs. And this is one of the few standalone multi-billion-dollar brands, similar to Nuerocrine and Ingrezza. So we tend to like companies with this profile. Again, they have a differentiated drug. Caplyta was one of the few newly approved schizophrenia or major depressive disorder drugs in the past few years. There's a bunch of generics, but there's some differentiating clinical characteristics in terms of the weight loss profile and the efficacy benefit, and some of the efficacy profile is a little differentiated. So that's what makes this interesting. So let me go through. I want to talk about one or two more, but I want to switch a little bit and talk about a little more of the underlying science and differentiation for some of these assets we're looking at. Obviously, I'm talking about financial metrics here, but the financial metrics are really a translation of the clinical and medical benefits of these therapies. And so Dynavax hasn't reported yet. And admittedly, the stock has sort of been in a tough run recently. But we think this is a great story for a differentiated clinical profile. And I just want to try to tell it briefly. So Dynavax has what is the best hepatitis B vaccine approved anywhere. And it has a very tortured history. The development of Dynavax is Heplisab, which is the branded name of the hepatitis B vaccine, took almost a decade. And there was a lot of fits and starts. They had to ultimately redo the pivotal trial because there was a potential safety signal observed. One of the challenges of doing vaccine development is tolerability for safety is quite low. To think about it, if you're otherwise a normal, healthy person, and you're taking a vaccine that's aimed to prevent a disease, you really don't want to tolerate an adverse event. If you're a late stage cancer patient with 6 months to live, you're probably going to tolerate a lot more, right? So think about the risk reward in the context of a normal, healthy ostensibly healthy patient who is getting vaccinated for hepatitis B. And the cool thing about the Dynavax platform is they have a proprietary adjuvant, which is an additive that they put into the vaccine that enhances the robustness of the immune response. So in the case of Dynavax, it's called toll-like receptor 9. TLR9 is the acronym abbreviation. And TLR9 stimulates the immune response, and the immunogenicity induction from this vaccine is vastly superior to legacy approved hepatitis B vaccines from GSK and others. So they have the best data because of this novel adjuvant. Again, this is a science-driven innovation, but it took them, more than 10 years to get this approved. I remember, when I started as an analyst back before the financial crisis, Dynavax was working on developing this Hep B vaccine, and here we are, almost 20 years later, and it's approved. So let me just show you just a little bit. Excuse me. A little bit of the highlights here. So hopefully I set the stage for the scientific and clinical differentiation of the product, and this is from Dynavax's last quarter. Quarterly sales can be choppy here, so I don't think you should live and die on the quarter. I think you want to look at the big picture for this one, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But so this is that adjuvant, the CpG 1018. That's TLR9 adjuvant, and they are really working on achieving majority market share. As I mentioned, they have the best clinical profile. It takes a while to take over a market, and especially for something like a vaccine where the legacy vaccines have been around for decades, so it's somewhat difficult to displace them, but you can do it with better data, and that's what Dynavax is doing. Let me just show you the share gain data. This is really impressive, and again, reflective of the underlying clinical and medical benefit. So 24% in the most recent really reported quarter growth, quarter on quarter. They now have 42% market share overall, compared to 39 at the end of period last year. So that's 3 points pickup. 59% market share in the retail segment, and 56% in IDN large clinics. So IDN is like integrated delivery network. Think of like Kaiser Permanente, these closed-end medical systems. And the reason why the adoption's higher for an IDN or a large clinic is because Kaiser Permanente, using an example, they have some responsibility for the health and well-being of their patients in terms of they're taking some financial risk for that. And so, of course, they're the most motivated to use the most efficacious Hep B vaccine, because if a patient unfortunately does come down with hepatitis B, they're going to be on the hook for the downstream medical care. So that's why you see higher penetration for these types of clients, again, because they're the most motivated to make sure the patients are protected. And they're going to have those patients, they would expect to have them under care for a long period of time. So this is really fantastic data. And I didn't tell you the best part about this yet. The best part about this is that there is no generic pathway for a vaccine. You ever heard of a generic vaccine? No, because it doesn't exist. Because going back to where we started, which is the safety and tolerability argument for taking a vaccine, there's such a high bar for demonstrated safety that if you want to get another vaccine approved, you have to run a full development program. There is no abbreviated pathway where you can leverage the data of another sponsor, which is the generic pathway that's used for small molecule drugs and biologics. Can't do it for vaccines. So this is one of the few revenue streams that you can really model into perpetuity, because there really aren't any other Hep B vaccines that are in development that could be match or exceed the profile that Dynavax has. And so it's a really interesting story, right? Most biotech assets you can't model in perpetuity, right? They have a branded life, and that goes away. This one, you could really make the argument that you should look at a DCF for a long period of time, and so we think this is actually it's top 5 holding for a reason. Pretty interesting company. There's also an activist shareholder that's just gotten involved, and the activist shareholder is my old boss, David from Deep Track Capital. So Deep Track is premier long short equity hedge fund. They bought 15% of Dynavax and disclosed that recently. And, the board just adopted a poison pill, yada, yada. But I think it speaks to, look, David's really smart and his team's really smart. And they've done the math on what the present value of those future cash flows is, and it's a substantial premium to where it's trading. So this is an interesting one, and hopefully that'll give you a little flavor. All right, I'm going to do two more quick ones, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So let me jump in on Harmony. James was asking me about this today, and so Harmony Biosciences, they have a drug approved for excessive daytime sleepiness related to narcolepsy. And they reported their quarter yesterday, and the quarter was actually really good. But then today, it was announced that there's a secondary sale by some large existing shareholders, which is unfortunately crushing the stock today, although it might be an opportunity if it goes low enough. But let me go through the quarter first, and then we'll talk about the selling shareholders second. But just it's an interesting dynamic where the fundamentals of the business were validated. The quarter was great. The stock was ripping yesterday, and it's sort of giving it all back today on the insider sales, which these things are hard to predict. And I think in the short term, obviously, it's going to be a source of pressure for a stock like this. But I think ultimately, if you wash it out, we'll see where it prices tonight. I think JP Morgan's doing it. And it's more than 10% of the float, by the way. So that's massive. Actually, I think the stock's holding up okay, given the magnitude of the secondary. But let's talk about quarter. So here's the press release of the quarter. So the Wakix is this drug that's approved for excessive daytime sleepiness. So they're announcing they've now surpassed $2 billion in cumulative net revenue, and the quarter was pretty good. They beat for the quarter, top and bottom line, and then they reiterated full year guide of 700 to 720 million, which is interesting because remember I was talking about Caplyta a moment ago, which is a $9 billion market cap. These guys are sub 2, so there's clearly a different outlook for what's going to happen with this drug. And this is probably one of the cheaper profitable biotech companies that's out there right now in terms of that has a drug that's going to do over $1 billion of revenue at peak, or at least appears to be on track to do over $1 billion revenue at peak, to have a sub $2 billion market cap and be profitable is it stands out. There's some reasons for that. This company was the target of a short report, which turned out to be completely erroneous, but it definitely pressured the stock. And there's some concerns about the ultimate competitive landscape in EDS, and some of those have merit. But suffice it to say, the stock is really pretty inexpensive relative to a lot of the peer groups, and they have an existing. I'll just highlight the buyback. It's here at the end of the press release here. Where is it? Should be right here. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, they still have $150 million authorized for share repurchase. So let's talk about the selling shareholders. So let's look at the folders. So these are the two groups that are selling shares. They're actually not selling all their shares because in aggregate they own 40% of the company almost. But they're taking a piece off. And again, I think that it's going to be a near-term headwind, but I think if the shares go low, and like I said, I think it could be an opportunity. Let me show you the multiples where this thing's trading. Yeah, it's 12 times current. If you believe the growth rate, it's going to be fractional, and it trades at just a couple turns revenue. This is just to give you a flavor. This is at the low end of what you see for these companies. I think the high end is kind of 5, 6, 7x revenue typically. Low end you're kind of 2, especially if it's profitable. So would have been nice not to have the secondary share sale pushing down the stock, but sometimes you get that. And again, you can look at it as an opportunity if it gets dislocated enough. All right, let me do one more science-driven story, and then I'll open it up to questions. But so last one I want to touch on is Verona, and this is a company that's developing, or that has developed, a new drug for pulmonary disease called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is characterized by restricted airways, reduced ability to breathe and exchange oxygen, et cetera, and can be certainly debilitating for patients over time. And stock has just been on a tear, and so we got involved in this stock before the pivotal data was released. So they were, if you rewind the tape, a year or so ago, Verona has been developing this PDE3/4 inhibitor for COPD, and you had to do 2 phase 3 randomized clinical trials as part of the registration package to file for FDA approval, and both of those trials read out successfully. And so, I think we own it. I don't know, Paul. I think below $20, which I think's not too bad. But let me go to the slides here. This is the company slide deck, just to give you a little flavor. So this is the drug that I'm mentioning. It just got approved a couple months ago, but again, we were involved in it when it was still development stage, so before they had the phase 3 data. And let's just go through this a little bit, right? So this is the first new mechanism approved with this mechanism. So that's what makes it unique, right? What you're really looking for in drug discovery development are obviously drugs that work, but also that are differentiated. And in this case, this is one of the few standalone available differentiated COPD solutions. So this is really cool. So let me just talk about the mechanism just for a second, just to give you a little flavor for some of the underlying science that defines the clinical potential of these products. So phosphodiesterase 3 and 4, excuse me, are implicated in a number of mechanisms, but in COPD patients, you tend to get an upregulation of PDE3 and 4, and it's associated with, again, some of the COPD pathology of the bronchoconstriction, of local inflammation, which ultimately limits the effectiveness of a lung to exchange air, et cetera. And so, the drug acts by, on the cellular level, increasing cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP, which have an impact on increasing bronchodilation, so allowing more blood to flow and exchange more efficiently, decreasing the inflammatory response locally, again, to help alleviate some of that constriction and also increase ciliary function, so to increase the mucociliary clearance on the lung side, again, to improve the air exchange. So incidentally, PDE5 inhibitors, which some of you might have heard of, that's a drug class used for erectile dysfunction, so Viagra and sildenafil, et cetera, are PDE5 targeted therapy. So you can imagine this family is involved in allowing blood to flow and some of these effects. But again, Verona has the first and only PDE3/4 inhibitor that's inhaled, that's approved for COPD. I just want to show you a little bit of the data. It's timely given my cough. I'm going to excuse my cough today. So this was the approval study, and I just want to touch on this just for a second. So what you had to show in the clinical trial was an increase in average FEV1. FEV1 is forced expiratory volume, so that's how much air you can expel from your lungs in 1 second. And so they showed about a 90 milliliter increase in air volume expiration. So again, that's a good measure for lung function, how effective the lungs are working. You can also look at peak and morning trough and some other measures, but I just want to give you a little flavor for what are the actual measurements that you're doing that you demonstrated that this drug is improving lung function. So this is a very big market, and I would put this company in the category of potential acquisition candidates. Again, there's some white space here with the indication, big market. This could be a $1 billion, $2 billion drug, easy. I think there's good potential. Hard to predict M&A, and some of it's idiosyncratic, but we think there's great potential here. So with that, that's why we've held on to it. Let me pause. I see one question here. Let me just get to it here. Yeah, question around big pharma doing acquisitions. Do they have enough cash or thoughts on their own pipeline? So if you look at the group of big pharmas over the next, call it 5 or 6 years, there's going to be about $200 billion of branded drug revenue that will lose exclusivity protection in that period of time. Part of that are patent expirations. Part of that is this new Inflation Reduction Act price control mechanism where the government is negotiating on behalf of Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services discounted prices for pharma drugs. And just on that latter point, we just got the first crop of drug prices announced a couple of months ago, and from a net price perspective, it's about a 15 to 20% discount. So far from the draconian worst case scenario, but still a step down. So that's the big picture setup here. There's never been more branded drug revenue that's been exposed to loss of exclusivity than there will be over the next 5 or 6 years. So that's the backdrop. So I think the short answer is every single large pharma is in need of growing and augmenting top line through acquisition. Each one's going to have a little different strategy in terms of the bite size, in terms of the therapeutic areas, but every single drug or company that looks like Verona or Intra-Cellular Therapeutics or Nuerocrine, we look at every one of these as for sale, and every one of these is potentially an acquisition candidate. What you haven't seen in the past few months is, M&A has been really slow. And what we've heard through the grapevine is a lot of the big pharma BD teams they want a little more clarity on what's going to happen with the FTC. I think many people are aware that the current FTC chair has been, a little more of an activist, and the FTC has taken a little more of an aggressive stance against M&A than we've seen in for recent administrations. And I think there's an optimism that will change, and there'll be some accelerating M&A as a result of that, with more clarity on what the disposition of the FTC is going to be. We also typically see an uptick in M&A after an election cycle. So again, there's some uncertainty about what's going to happen in the election. I think with that in the rearview mirror, it sets up well, I think, for M&A through the end of the year. I would be shocked if we don't see a couple of December or next January deals, $1 billion plus deals. I would expect to see a few of them. Whether they're these companies or not is hard to predict. But I think that we will see some more M&A, and it should be a boon to the sector. And one more trend I'll just touch on briefly is there's been a rise of private company M&A deals, actually. And we've seen, half a dozen or more in recent months. So there's been more private companies targeted by big pharma in recent months than public companies. I think that's a relatively short-term phenomenon. I think that there's again, going back to the big picture of the last 5 years, a lot of companies that didn't get public in this sort of blow-off top period through early 21 were sort of saddled with relatively high valuations, and the insiders have been funding them for a while. And I think a lot of those companies are at the point where they're willing to take a more bargain M&A deal than they might have otherwise. So I think as you work through those, excuse me, the focus will return to public imaging. So with that, maybe I'll take a breath. Are there, other questions, comments?
Mark, I think you hit everything we wanted to, regarding the upcoming election and, maybe how the FTC might look next couple of years and, the main thing being the loss of exclusivity. Anything you want to kind of wrap up with?
Yeah, I mean, like I think that, if we stand back and look at the big picture, I mean, I kind of alluded to it a little bit, but biotech's been a tough place to be for a couple of years now. And major indices are ratcheting all-time highs. These growth momentum stocks have been fantastic performers, and a lot of that's been deserved, right? They've generated some really interesting revenue growth rates. But, I think that nothing happens in a straight line forever. And, we do believe that when we start to see a bit of a rotation, companies that like the ones that I'm highlighting, we think are going to get some more attention because Paul, I guess maybe the punchline of this is if you believe the broader economic environment could face some headwinds or could deteriorate, these biotech companies, like I showed you today, those compound growth rates are relatively independent of the broader economic environment, right? That the demand for life-saving schizophrenia or COPD drug or any of these that we talked about, that's inelastic demand, and those growth rates I think are going to be there and they're going to be robust regardless of your macro outlook. So I think that I like the setup from the perspective of election in the rearview mirror. Maybe you get some improvements in the FTC. Certainly you get, in any mixed government scenario, expectations for new draconian health policy changes are low, right? No. One thing you didn't hear in the debates, Paul, you didn't hear drug pricing discussed. You didn't hear, it's not a focus. There's a lot of other issues that, both parties are focused on. This isn't it right now. So we think that that's going to be a good thing to have it in the rearview mirror. We think there are going to be some more M&A. And if you do see a whiff of an economic downturn, boy, these companies with double-digit CAGR profiles that are going to robustly deliver economic results independent of the broader economic environment should be more attractive. So that's how we're seeing it.
Mark, one question just came through. Maybe we could just hit it quickly. The relative weakness of some of the big pharmas like Pfizer and Merck, would you attribute that to some of the larger acquisitions they made over the past cycle and just kind of the digestion of those?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So let's just take a second on Pfizer. So obviously Pfizer was the major beneficiary for COVID revenues. Let's show you the 5-year chart, right? I mean, look at this thing. Like it was $60 stock and it's been cut in half. They had that $100 billion quarter with the peak COVID revenue. No, it's $100 billion, and it's been sort of down. So look, Pfizer bought Seattle Genetics, which I think those are good drugs, but they paid a really high price. So if you think about, what's the challenge for Pfizer is that they don't have a great growth profile. One, because the COVID comps were so robust, it was hard to top that. But two, some of their major brands, again, this is that theme we're talking about, Paul. They're fighting exclusivity loss. So if you look at the underlying business, I'll just do it real quick. Right. So they just reported the other day, by the way, and actually they did a beat and raise. The stock traded down because people were upset that the beat was on Paxlovid and COVID vaccine, which durability is a question. But if you look at Prevnar, right, this is their leading non-COVID franchise. This is the monoclonal vaccine. There's a lot of competitive pressure coming for Prevnar, and folks are modeling decline. Eliquis, this is going to face IRA price control. Ibrance, this is their breast cancer franchise. Novartis Kisqali is a better CDK inhibitor, and they're losing share to Novartis. So this is declining. So I could do more, but I hope you get a sense, right? All of Pfizer's major existing franchises are under threat. Now, the stock is cheap, right? It's a 5% dividend yield, give or take, and it's a single digit multiple. So that's the good news. I don't think it could go much lower, but you got to re-rate the growth story. And how do you do that? Well, I think the Seagen acquisition was good. It's going to take time to play out. They're going to pull more cost out of that. I think but they paid such a high price. I don't know about the accretion potential. And the X factor for Pfizer is the obesity program. They disappointed the street with their obesity assets. They haven't been able to get any credit for it. So, you don't have great growth outlook. You don't have an exciting pipeline story. How do you reignite? Because look at this is consensus top line, right? It's flat for 5 years. So it's a great cash flow story, but there needs to be what's the sizzle, and I think that's what's plaguing Pfizer. And look, there's activists involved with Pfizer now, and I think more cost is going to come out of the business, and I think that you probably will see them do some more M&A. Oh, by the way, they announced one of the most shocking M&A updates I've ever heard, where they acquired a sickle cell disease drug from a company called Global Blood Therapeutics for about $5 billion. They just withdrew that drug from the market, and they're writing it down to zero because of a safety issue. So that's part of the activist investor push here is like, hey, you guys did some bad BD. You shouldn't have bought Global Blood for $5 billion. And then a year later, write it down to zero. That's pretty bad stuff. And I think that's fair criticism of the company. And look, I think they're going to do more deals because they're going to have to. Let's do Merck real quick. Merck is a little different story. The challenge with Merck is it's a blessing and a curse. So Merck has the world's best oncology medicine in Keytruda. Keytruda is the king in oncology, right? This is the PD-1 compound that it enhances immune response, so it can be used broadly across all kinds of cancers, right? So this is the world's best-selling drug. It's the world's best-selling oncology franchise. Look at this thing. This year it's going to do almost 30 billion, right? That's half of Merck's revenue. And so Merck in the near term has great growth because Keytruda is a beast and it's going to just keep churning. The challenge is that Keytruda is probably going to come under the Inflation Reduction Act price controls in the next 5 years. So without that, Merck is off to the races, right? Keytruda is approved for more than 50 discrete oncology indications. This is like no other drug is even close. But the challenge for Merck is what else is in the pipeline. So Merck actually has done some interesting BD. So these are the drugs that they've acquired. Winrevair is one everybody's watching, so I think Merck's BD, excuse me, has been better than Pfizer's. They haven't had any big wipeouts, and folks are modeling these to be pretty big contributors, but you can't replace 30 billion, Paul. This is the problem. And so near term, I think Merck's going to beat and raise its way for the next year or two. I think there's pretty good confidence in that. It's just what happens after that. That's where it gets hard. Merck doesn't really have a clear obesity strategy. So I would put Merck, Paul, into the category of a company. You're going to see them do some more BD because they have the firepower, right? They've got a lot of cash. Let's look at the leverage real quick. I looked at this a while, but so yeah, I mean, a lot of these companies don't have a net cash position, but you can lever this up. So look, they can do $10+ billion deals. Easy. So I would put Merck into the camp of, they're going to beat and raise for the most part. Folks are worried about Keytruda. They're going to do more BD because they have to.
Well, it's a good way to wrap it up, Mark. Really appreciate your time. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to reach out. But we're really excited to watch this these themes kind of re-energize over the next couple of years here.
Yeah, thanks,
So,
Paul. We're looking forward to having some tailwinds, not the headwinds we've had recently.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day,
Take
everybody.
care.